While the grand ball lit up the ranch with laughter, music and silk gowns, she was outside in muddy boots, hammer in hand, fixing a broken fence that no one else cared about. She didn't belong in that world of chandeliers and champagne. But then the richest cowboy in the county, the one every woman dreamed of dancing with, stepped out of the ballroom and called her name. What began as a quiet night of labor turned into an unexpected invitation that would blur the lines between class, pride, and the secrets buried beneath the ranch's golden lights. What could a man who had everything possibly want with a woman who had nothing but calloused hands and honest work? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've something extra special for you. Clara Bennett had been mending fences on the Whitmore Ranch for 20 years, and in all that time, she'd learned that honest work spoke louder than fancy words ever could. At 47, her hands told the story of those years. Calloused palms, strong fingers that could grip a post driver or gentle a spooked horse with equal ease. Her father's old leather work gloves hung from her belt, worn smooth by 2 generations of labor, and she touched them sometimes without thinking, the way another woman might touch a locket or a wedding ring. The Wyoming sky stretched endless above her that evening, painted in shades of amber and rose as the sun settled behind the mountains. She'd volunteered for fence duty. Truth be told, the annual charity ball was in full swing inside the main house, and Clara had no interest in watching from the margins while women in silk gowns twirled across polished floors. She knew her place, and more importantly, she was content with it. There was dignity in work well done, in a fence line that would hold through winter storms, in livestock kept safe because someone cared enough to check every post and wire. The Whitmore Ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime grazing land, nestled in a valley where the Wind River Range met the sky. The main house stood 3 stories tall, built from local stone and timber, with wide porches that wrapped around all 4 sides. Tonight, every window blazed with light, and even from half a mile away, Clara could hear the faint strains of the orchestra. She'd seen the preparations for weeks. Extra staff brought in from town, mountains of food delivered, the ballroom chandelier lowered and cleaned until every crystal caught the light like captured stars. She hefted the silver hammer, testing the weight in her hand. It had been her husband Tom's, and before that his father's. The handle was darkened with age and use, fitted perfectly to her grip after all these years. 3 more posts to reset before dark, and she'd have this section secure. The work was methodical, soothing. Drive the post, tamp the earth, string the wire, test the tension. Her body knew the rhythm without conscious thought. Mrs. Dorothy, the head housekeeper, had clucked her tongue that morning when Clara announced her plans. "You could come to the ball, you know," she'd said, flour dusting her brown hands as she rolled out pie dough. "Miss Whitmore always says the whole ranch family is welcome." Clara had smiled and shook her head. "I'd be about as comfortable in that ballroom as a trout in a tree, Dorothy. Besides, someone needs to check that north pasture fence had some weather damage last week." Dorothy had given her a long look, the kind that said she saw right through to the heart of things, but she'd only nodded. "Suit yourself, but if you change your mind, I set aside one of my good dresses. We're about the same size." The other ranch hands had already cleaned up and headed into town for their own celebration. Clara had waved them off cheerfully. She'd raised 2 children on this ranch, both grown now and living their own lives. Her daughter taught school in Cheyenne. Her son worked construction in Denver. They called every Sunday dutiful and loving, but they'd made their own paths, as children should. Tom had been gone 8 years now. Heart attack. Sudden and fine. She'd mourned him proper, still missed him on cold mornings and in the quiet before sleep. But she'd learned that grief and contentment could exist side by side, if you let them. A coyote called in the distance, and Clara paused to listen. The evening was cooling fast, the way it did in the high country. She'd need her jacket soon. The fence post stood straight and true. The wire hummed with proper tension when she plucked it. Good work, honest work, She moved to the next post, her boots crunching on the dried grass. The smell of sage and dust rose around her, familiar as her own breathing. This land had shaped her, given her purpose and a living. She knew every drawer and coulee, every spring and rock outcropping. Knowledge earned through years of attention, of caring enough to notice. The Whitmore family had owned this land for 3 generations now. Clara remembered old Edward Whitmore, James's grandfather. A hard man but fair in his way, he'd hired her husband Tom straight out of high school, given them a small house on the property when they married. Then came James Whitmore II, who expanded the operation, brought in modern equipment, made the ranch one of the most profitable in the state. He'd been different from his father. Sharper edges, less patience for the old ways. But he'd kept the workers on, paid decent wages, and that counted for something. Now James Whitmore III ran things, and Clara had watched him grow from a serious boy who preferred books to cattle into a man who carried the weight of legacy on his shoulders like a yoke. He was 52 now, never married despite his mother's best efforts and the parade of suitable women she'd introduced over the years. He'd come back from college in the East with ideas about sustainable ranching, about treating the land and the workers with equal respect. Some of the old guard had grumbled, but Clara had seen the difference. New safety equipment, fair scheduling, health benefits that actually covered a family. She respected James Whitmore, though she'd never presumed to know him beyond their brief exchanges about ranch business. He was the owner. She was the hired hand. That was the natural order of things, and Clara had never been one to question what worked. But she'd noticed things over the years. The way he walked the fence lines himself sometimes, checking the work with a careful eye. The way he remembered the names of workers' children, asked after sick relatives. The loneliness that seemed to settle on him when he thought no one was watching. The light was fading faster now, that particular quality of dusk that turned the whole world soft and uncertain. Clara pulled on her jacket, a worn denim thing patched at the elbows, and reached for the next post. This one had rotted at the base, would need replacing entirely. She'd marked it 3 days ago, brought the new cedar post out yesterday on the back of the truck. Cedar lasted longer, resisted the rot that came from constant exposure to moisture and freeze-thaw cycles. She was digging out the old post, her shovel biting into the earth with satisfying chunks, when she heard footsteps behind her. Not the usual ranch hand stride, but the measured pace of dress shoes on grass. Clara straightened, brushing dirt from her hands, and turned to find James Whitmore himself walking toward her across the pasture. He'd shed his suit jacket, carried it over one arm, and his white shirt gleamed in the failing light. His tie was loosened, top button undone, as though he'd made some compromise between the formality of the ball and the reality of walking through a cattle pasture. He was a tall man, lean rather than bulky, with grey threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting at distant horizons. "Miss Clara?" he called out, and there was something in his voice that made her stand a little straighter. Not formality exactly, but a kind of respect that acknowledged her as more than just another employee. "Mr. Whitmore?" she replied, keeping her voice even. "Something wrong with the party?" He stopped a few feet away, close enough to talk without shouting, far enough to be proper. "Party's fine. Music's loud, conversations predictable, and everyone's dancing the same dances we've been dancing for 30 years. He smiled slightly, and Clara noticed how tired he looked, despite the careful grooming. "I saw you out here from the study window. Thought I'd take a walk, get some air." Clara nodded, unsure what to say. In 20 years, James Whitmore had never sought her out for casual conversation. Their exchanges had always been purposeful. A question about pasture rotation, a discussion about which bulls to keep for breeding, confirmation about supply orders. This felt different, though she couldn't quite name why. "Why, that post giving you trouble?" he asked, gesturing to her work. Nothing I can't handle, Clara said, rotted through at the base. Happens with the older pine posts. This cedar should last another 20 years, maybe more. James stepped closer, examining the post with genuine interest. You learned from your father. And my husband, Clara said. Tom worked this ranch for 15 years before he passed. He knew every inch of fence line, could tell you which sections, condition just by walking them once a season. Said the land talks to you if you listen long enough. Wise man, James said quietly. He was silent for a moment, looking out across the darkening pasture. The music from the house drifted faintly on the evening breeze, a waltz that sounded thin and distant against the vastness of the landscape. I envy that kind of knowledge, the kind that comes from years of paying attention. Clara studied him carefully. There was something in his voice, a weariness that went deeper than a long day. You've been running this place for 12 years now, Mr. Whitmore. I'd say you've earned your own kind of knowing. He turned to look at her then, and she saw surprise in his eyes, as though he hadn't expected her to speak so plainly. Maybe so, though sometimes I wonder if I'm just going through the motions my father set in place, following a path someone else cut through the brush. It was the kind of confession a man didn't usually make to a hired hand, and Clara felt the weight of it. She chose her words carefully. Every generation has to decide what to keep and what to change. From what I've seen, you've done right by this place, and the people who work it. That counts for something. James smiled, a real smile this time, that reached his eyes. High praise from someone who doesn't give it lightly. He paused, then said, almost abruptly, would you join us at the ball, Clara? I'd value your company. Clara felt her stomach drop. Of all the things she'd expected him to say, this wasn't among them. Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate the thought, but I'm hardly dressed for a society gathering. She gestured to her work clothes, the mud on her boots, the dirt under her fingernails. The ball is supposed to be for everyone on the ranch, James said. That's what my grandfather intended when he started the tradition. Somewhere along the way it became something else, something more exclusive. I'd like to change that, starting tonight. Clara shook her head slowly. With respect, sir, I'd stick out like a sore thumb in that crowd. Those folks don't want a ranch hand tracking dirt across their dance floor. Those folks need reminding that this ranch runs on more than their donations and goodwill, James said, and there was an edge to his voice now. Not anger, but something like frustration. You've worked this land for 2 decades. You've earned a place at that table more than half the people in that ballroom. She met his eyes directly. Maybe so, but there's a difference between earning something and being comfortable claiming it. I know my worth, Mr. Whitmore, and it doesn't need a ballroom to prove it. He held her gaze for a long moment, and Clara saw respect there, mixed with something that might have been loneliness. Fair enough, he said finally, but the invitation stands. If you change your mind, Mrs. Dorothy has everything you might need. I'd be honored to have you there. They stood in the gathering darkness, the distance between employer and employee suddenly feeling both vast and narrow. Clara felt something shift in the air, though she couldn't have named it. I'll think on it, she heard herself say, surprising them both. James nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. That's all I ask. He glanced back toward the house, where light spilled from every window. I should get back before they send a search party. But Clara, about that expansion plan I mentioned last week, the one about rotating the north pastures differently, I'd value your input. Maybe we could discuss it over coffee sometime this week. Of course, Mr. Whitmore, Clara said, back on familiar ground. Ranch business, she understood. This other thing, whatever it was, felt like standing on uncertain footing. He started to walk away, then turned back. James, he said, when it's just us talking about the ranch, you can call me James. Mr. Whitmore was my father, and I'm trying not to make all his mistakes. Clara watched him walk back toward the house, his figure growing smaller against the lit windows until he disappeared inside. She stood there for a long moment, the silver hammer heavy in her hand, trying to sort through what had just happened. In 20 years, she'd had perhaps a dozen real conversations with any Whitmore, most of them brief exchanges about work. Now James had walked half a mile from his own party to invite her personally, had spoken to her like an equal, had asked her to use his given name. She turned back to the fence post, driving the shovel into the earth with more force than necessary. The old post came free with a sucking sound, roots tearing loose from soil that had held them for 15 years. She set it aside and positioned the new cedar post in the hole, checking the alignment with practiced eyes. The work settled her mind, gave her hands something to do while her thoughts caught up with the evening's strangeness. The truth was, part of her wanted to accept the invitation. Not for the ball itself, she had no illusions about fitting in with that crowd, but because James had asked, because he'd stood in a darkening pasture and spoken to her like she mattered, like her opinion held weight beyond just ranch operation. That was a rare thing in her experience, and it stirred something in her chest she'd thought long buried with Tom. But wanting something and it being wise were different matters entirely. Clara had built a good life here on clear boundaries and honest work. She knew her place, took pride in it, and didn't fool herself about changing the world. James might mean well with his invitation, might genuinely want to include the working folk in his society gathering, but that didn't change how those society people would see her. A curiosity at best, an embarrassment at worst. Still, she thought as she tamped earth around the new post, he'd called her Clara. Not Miss Bennet, not ma'am, just Clara, like they were neighbors chatting over a fence line instead of owner and employer, separated by wealth and class, and 100 unspoken rules about how such things worked. She finished securing the post and tested the wire tension one final time. Solid it would hold. The stars were coming out now, brilliant against the darkening sky, and the temperature was dropping fast. She gathered her tools, loading them into the back of the old pickup truck she'd driven out. Her father's work gloves hung from her belt, the leather warm from her body heat, and she touched them again, seeking comfort in their familiar weight. Tom would have told her to go to the ball. He'd always been braver than her about such things, more willing to push against boundaries. "What's the worst that can happen?" he'd say. "They look down their noses at us. Let him, we know our worth." But Tom had also been the one who taught her that dignity came from within, not from external validation. You didn't need approval from folks who measured worth in dollars and pedigree. The drive back to the workers' compound took 15 minutes, following dirt roads she could navigate blind. The small house she rented from the ranch sat dark and quiet, waiting. It had been her home since Tom died, after she'd let the bigger family house go to a younger couple with children. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen just big enough for one person, a front porch where she drank her morning coffee and watched the sun rise over the mountains. Inside, she heated leftover stew on the stove and ate standing at the counter, her mind still turning over the evening's event. Through the window, she could see the lights of the main house blazing in the distance, could imagine the dancing and laughter, the clink of crystal glasses and the rustle of expensive fabric. A different world, one she'd glimpsed from the edges, but never truly entered. She washed her single dish and was heading for bed when she heard a soft knock at her door. Opening it, she found Mrs. Dorothy standing there, a dress draped over her arm and a knowing smile on her round face. "Don't say a word," Dorothy said, pushing past Clara into the small living room. James came back inside looking like a man who'd just been told no, and I put 2 and 2 together. She held up the dress, a deep green that caught the lamplight. "It's simple, elegant, and it'll fit you perfect. I also brought shoes, because I know you don't own any that aren't boots." Clara opened her mouth to protest, but Dorothy held up a hand. "Before you start with all your reasons why not, let me tell you something. I've worked in that house for 30 years. I've seen 3 generations of Whitmores come and go, and I've never once seen young James walk out of his own party to personally invite someone back. Not once, Clara. That means something. It means he's being polite," Clara said. though her voice lacked conviction. Polite would be a general announcement that all staff are welcome, Dorothy countered. She laid the dress carefully across the back of Clara's worn sofa. Walking half a mile in dress shoes to talk to one specific person, that's something else entirely. She fixed Clara with a steady look. You're scared, Clara bristled. I'm not scared of anything. You're scared of what it might mean if you go. Scared of crossing a line you've been careful not to cross for 20 years. Dorothy's voice softened. I understand that. Tom's only been gone 8 years. You've built yourself a safe life here. One where you know the rules and don't have to risk getting hurt again. But honey, safe isn't the same as living. The words hit harder than Clara expected. She sank into her armchair, suddenly exhausted. I don't know how to be in that world, Dorothy. I'd make a fool of myself. You'd be yourself, which is more than most of those peacocks in there can claim. Dorothy sat on the sofa's arm, her considerable weight making it creak. Look, I'm not saying you need to fall in love or change your whole life. I'm saying a good man asked you to a dance, and maybe you should say yes, just this once. See what happens. Clara looked at the dress, really looked at it. The green was deep and rich, the kind of color that would bring out the hazel in her eyes. The fabric looked soft, well made. It was the sort of dress a respectable woman would wear to a nice event. Not flashy, but not plain either. Dignified. He mentioned something else, she said slowly. An engraved pocket watch. His father's. He was holding it while we talked, kept checking it like he was timing something. Dorothy nodded. His daddy's watch. Edward gave it to James II on his 21st birthday, and James II gave it to young James on his... It's got their initials engraved on the back, all 3 generations. He only carries it on special occasions, nights when he's thinking about legacy and what it all means. What does that have to do with inviting me to a ball? Maybe he's thinking about what kind of legacy he wants to build, Dorothy said. One that includes the people who actually make this ranch run, not just the society folks who show up once a year to feel charitable. She stood, brushing imaginary wrinkles from her own dress. I'll leave this here. You've got about an hour before the ball winds down if you want to make an appearance. If you don't, no harm done. But Clara, sometimes the biggest risk is not taking one at all. After Dorothy left, Clara sat in the quiet of her small house, the dress a splash of green in the corner of her vision. She thought about Tom, about the life they'd built together. Simple and honest. He'd been gone 8 years, but she still felt married somehow, still felt like putting on a fancy dress and going to a dance with another man would be a betrayal. But Tom had never held her back from anything. When she'd wanted to learn to ride, he'd taught her. When she'd wanted to work alongside the men instead of in the house, he'd supported her, even when others raised eyebrows. Life's too short to live it according to other people's rules, he used to say. You do what feels right, Clara girl, and the rest will sort itself out. She stood, walked to the dress, and ran her fingers over the soft fabric. It had been so long since she'd worn anything but work clothes, since she'd thought of herself as anything other than a ranch hand with calloused palms and dirt under her nails. But underneath all that, she was still a woman, still Clara, who'd once danced in her kitchen with her husband while dinner burned on the stove, who'd worn flowers in her hair at her own wedding, who'd felt beautiful once upon a time. The decision, when it came, felt less like choosing and more like surrendering to something inevitable. Clara picked up the dress and carried it to her bedroom. The shower water ran hot, washing away the day's honest dirt, and she found herself taking more care than usual, scrubbing until her skin felt new. Her hair, usually pulled back in a practical braid, she let down and brushed until it shone, silver threads catching the light among the brown. The dress fit perfectly, as Dorothy had promised. Clara stood before her small mirror, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back. The green brought color to her face, made her look less worn, more like someone who belonged somewhere other than a fence line. The shoes pinched a bit, but she could manage. She'd endured worse discomfort in her life. Her father's work gloves sat on the dresser, and she touched them one last time before leaving them behind. Tonight, she'd be someone different. Not better, not worse, just different. The walk to the main house took longer in the unfamiliar shoes, and with each step, Clara felt her resolve waver. She could still turn back, change into her regular clothes, pretend this moment of foolishness had never happened. No one would know except Dorothy, and Dorothy wouldn't judge. But then she remembered James standing in the pasture, the tired lines around his eyes, the way he'd said her name like it mattered. Whatever his reasons for inviting her, they'd been genuine. She owed him at least the courtesy of accepting, even if she only stayed for a few minutes. The main house rose before her, all lit windows and elegant proportions. Music drifted through the open doors, something classical and refined. Clara climbed the steps to the wide porch, her heart hammering in a way it hadn't since she was a young girl at her first social. Through the windows she could see the ballroom, couples moving in synchronized patterns across the gleaming floor. Women in gowns that cost more than Clara made in a year, men in tailored suits discussing business and politics. She almost turned around right there, almost convinced herself that this was a mistake, that she didn't belong in this glittering world of wealth and privilege. But then the door opened and James stood there, and the look on his face stopped her cold. Not surprise exactly, though there was some of that, more like relief, as though he'd been watching for her, hoping she'd come. "Clara," he said, and the warmth in his voice settled something in her chest. "You came." "I did," she managed, "though I'm still not sure it's a good idea." He stepped out onto the porch, and she saw he'd been holding the pocket watch, its gold case catching the light. He slipped it into his vest pocket with a small, almost embarrassed gesture. "May I?" he asked, offering his arm. Clara hesitated only a moment before taking it. His arm was solid under the fine fabric of his shirt, and she could feel the warmth of him, in through the layers. Together they walked into the ballroom, and Clara felt every eye turned toward them. The music continued, but conversations paused mid-sentence. Women leaned toward each other, whispering behind gloved hands. Men raised eyebrows, exchanged glances weighted with judgment and speculation. James seemed not to notice, or perhaps he simply didn't care. He led her across the floor with the easy confidence of a man in his own home, nodding to guests as they passed. Clara kept her head high, remembering her father's words from long ago. "Dignity comes from how you carry yourself, not from what others think of you." They stopped near the refreshment table, and James handed her a glass of champagne. "You look beautiful," he said quietly, "for her ears only. I'm glad you changed your mind." "Dorothy can be very persuasive," Clara said, taking a small sip. The champagne was dry and cold, bubbles tickling her nose. She'd never developed a taste for alcohol, preferred coffee and water, but she could appreciate the quality. "Remind me to give her a raise," James said, and there was humor in his eyes now. Some of the earlier weariness faded. "Would you dance with me, Clara? I promise to only step on your toes once or twice." Before she could answer, a woman's voice cut through the moment like a knife through silk. "James, darling, you've been hiding." Victoria Ashford glided toward them, her silk gown shimmering like water in moonlight. She was beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful, perfectly maintained and carefully displayed. Her blonde hair was arranged in an elaborate style. Diamonds glittered at her throat and ears, and her smile held all the warmth of a Wyoming winter. "I was beginning to think you'd abandoned your own party." James's arm tensed slightly under Clara's hand, but his voice remained pleasant. "Just getting some air, Victoria. May I introduce Clara Bennett? She manages our livestock operations and has been with the ranch for 20 years. Victoria's eyes swept over Clara in one swift, assessing glance, taking in everything from the borrowed dress to the work-roughened hands. Clara couldn't hide. "How charming," she said, the words somehow managing to sound like the opposite. "James has always been so democratic in his friendship. Tell me, Miss Bennett, are you enjoying your first taste of high society?" Clara felt the sting in the words, but kept her expression calm. She dealt with difficult cattle, ornery horses, and men who thought women had no business doing ranch work. She could handle one condescending socialite. "I'm enjoying the company," she said evenly, meeting Victoria's eyes. "Though I confess the champagne's a bit dry for my taste." A flicker of something surprise, perhaps, crossed Victoria's face before the smooth mask returned. "How refreshingly honest. James, you really must introduce Miss Bennet to the Havisham sisters. They've been asking about your expansion plans." Her smile sharpened. "I'm sure they'd be fascinated to hear the perspective of someone who actually works the land." The dismissal was clear, but James didn't move. "Actually, Victoria, I was just about to dance with Clara. Perhaps you could check on the orchestra. I believe they were having some issue with the music selection." Victoria's smile froze. For a moment, Clara thought she might say something cutting, but she simply inclined her head and swept away, trailing expensive perfume and barely concealed irritation. "I apologize for that," James said quietly. "Victoria has certain expectations about how things should be done." "She wants you," Clara said bluntly. "Has for years, if I'm reading things right." James looked startled, then laughed, a genuine sound that drew more eyes their way. "You don't mince words, do you?" "Never saw much point in it," Clara said. She set down her champagne glass, suddenly feeling the weight of all the stares, all the whispered conversations happening around them. "Mr. Whitmore, James, I appreciate the invitation, but maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all. I'm making you uncomfortable with your own guests." "You're the only person here who's made me comfortable all evening," James said, and there was something raw in his voice, something that made Clara look at him more closely. "Everyone else wants something. Victoria wants a husband with the right pedigree and bank account. The Havishams want investment opportunities. The charity board wants larger donations. You're the only one who came here tonight, not wanting anything from me except maybe the truth." Clara considered this, saw the loneliness in him more clearly now. "That's a hard way to live." "It's the only way I know," James said. He offered his arm again. "One dance, Clara. Then if you want to leave, I'll walk you home myself. But give me one dance where I can pretend I'm just a man who asked a woman he respects to share a waltz. Please." There was no artifice in the request, no hidden agenda, just honesty, and Clara had always responded to honesty. She took his arm and let him lead her onto the dance floor. The orchestra was playing something slow and elegant, and Clara sent up a silent prayer of thanks. She hadn't danced in years, not since Tom died, and her memory of the steps was rusty at best. James placed one hand at her waist, took her hand in his, and began to move. Clara followed, stumbling slightly at first, but he was patient, guiding her through the patterns with quiet confidence. "You're doing fine," he murmured as they turned. "Better than half the people here who've been taking lessons since childhood." "You're a kind liar," Clara said, but she smiled despite herself. There was something unexpectedly pleasant about moving in rhythm with another person, about the solid warmth of his hand at her waist, the way he anticipated her steps and adjusted his own to match. Around them, other couples moved in their own orbits, but Clara found herself focusing only on the man in front of her, on the surprising ease of this moment. "Tell me something," James said. "Something true, something you've never told anyone else." Clara looked up at him, startled by the request. "That's a strange thing to ask while dancing. Maybe, but we're surrounded by people who only ever tell me what they think I want to hear. I'd like to hear something real." She thought about it as they moved through another turn. The ballroom lights caught in the chandelier overhead, casting moving shadows across the polished floor. Finally, she said, "I was relieved when Tom died." James's steps faltered slightly, but he recovered. "That's honest. He was in pain for months before the heart attack. Couldn't work. Could barely get out of bed some days. The doctors said there was nothing to be done, that we just had to wait." Clara's voice was steady, but the memory still hurt. When it finally happened, when he was gone, the first thing I felt was relief, not grief. Not at first, just relief that he wasn't suffering anymore, that I didn't have to watch him fade. The guilt over that feeling nearly ate me alive. But you learned to carry it, James said quietly. I learned that we're more complicated than we like to admit, that you can love someone and still feel relief when they're gone, that guilt and grief and gratitude can all exist in the same breath. She met his eyes. Your turn, something true. James was quiet for a moment, guiding her through the dance with practiced ease. When he spoke, his voice was low. I don't know if I want any of this. The ranch, the legacy, the expectations. Sometimes I think about selling it all, moving somewhere no one knows the Whitmore name, and finding out who I'd be without all of it weighing on me. But you won't, Clara said, understanding him better now. No, I won't, because my grandfather built this place from nothing, and my father expanded it, and now it's my turn to carry it forward. That's what legacy means. The weight of all the people who came before, all their choices and mistakes, and triumphs, resting on your shoulders, whether you want them there or not. The music swelled around them, and Clara found herself thinking about her father's work, gloves hanging in her small house, about Tom's silver hammer, about all the ways we carry the dead with us. Maybe legacy doesn't have to be about weight, she said. Maybe it can be about choice. You take what was good, let go of what wasn't, and build something new that honors both. James looked at her with something like wonder. When did you become so wise? Around the same time I learned that champagne gives me a headache and silk makes me itch, Clara said, and was rewarded with his laugh. The song was ending, couples beginning to separate and drift toward the refreshment tables or the terrace door. Clara felt the cold air rushing in from outside and shivered slightly in the thin dress. James noticed immediately. You're cold. Wait here. He disappeared into the crowd and returned moments later with a silk shawl, deep burgundy with gold threads woven through the fabric. This belongs to my mother. She kept it here for evenings like this. He draped it carefully over Clara's shoulders, and the silk was soft and warm, smelling faintly of lavender and cedar. I can't wear your mother's shawl, Clara protested, even as she pulled it closer. She'd be glad to know it was being used. She always said beautiful things should be worn, not locked away in closets. James's expression grew distant for a moment. She died 5 years ago. Cancer. By the end, she weighed less than 90 pounds, but she still insisted on getting dressed every morning, still wore her jewelry and her favorite clothes. Said she wasn't going to let the disease taint her dignity along with everything else. She sounds like a strong woman, Clara said softly, touching the shawl with new reverence. She was. You remind me of her sometimes, that same quiet strength, that refusal to apologize for who you are. James smiled, though sadness lingered in his eyes. She would have liked you. Before Clara could respond, a portly man with impressive mutton chops approached, hand extended. James, my boy, excellent party as always. And who is this lovely lady? The next hour passed in a blur of introduction. James guided Clara through the social landscape with surprising care, presenting her not as a ranch hand, but as an essential part of the operation, someone whose expertise and knowledge had helped shape the ranch's success. Some guests responded with genuine interest, asking intelligent questions about livestock management and land conservation. Others, like Victoria's Circle, offered polite smiles that never reached their eyes. Clara handled it all, with the same calm she brought to ornery cattle. She spoke plainly when asked questions, didn't pretend to know things she didn't, and refused to be intimidated by wealth or pedigree. She was who she was, and she'd learned long ago that trying to be anything else was exhausting and pointless. Around midnight, the orchestra took a break, and the crowd thinned as people moved to the terrace or the library for cigars and brandy. Clara found herself standing near the tall windows, looking out at the dark landscape she knew so well. The fence she'd been repairing was invisible in the darkness, but she could picture it exactly, could see in her mind's eye the new cedar post, standing straight and true. "Penny for your thoughts," James said, appearing at her elbow with 2 cups of coffee. "I noticed you weren't drinking the champagne." Clara accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "I was thinking about how different the same place looks depending on where you're standing. From here, the ranch looks like something out of a painting, all elegant and romantic. From out there, working the fence line, it's dirt and wire and hard labor. Both views are true, but they're almost completely different. Which view do you prefer?" "The one that's honest," Clara said. "Pretty lies are still lies." She sipped the coffee, grateful for its familiar taste. "Thank you for this evening, James. It's been educational." "Educational," he repeated, amused. "That's one way to describe it. I was hoping for something more along the lines of enjoyable." "It's been that too," Clara admitted. "More than I expected, if I'm honest. But I think we both know this is a one-time thing. Come tomorrow, I'll be back in my work clothes, fixing fences, and you'll be back to running the ranch and dealing with people like Victoria, who actually belong in your world." James set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "What if I don't want it to be a one-time thing?" Clara's heart did something complicated in her chest. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't start something we both know can't go anywhere. You're the owner. I'm the hired hand. There are rules about these things, invisible lines that exist for good reasons. Rules can be changed. Lines can be crossed. And then what?" Clara turned to face him fully. "We cause a scandal that makes both our lives hard. I lose my job because the other workers think I'm getting special treatment. Victoria and her friends make your life miserable because you chose the wrong woman." She shook her head. "I've built a good life here, James. A simple one, maybe, but it's mine and I know where I stand in it. I'm not willing to risk that for something that can't last." "You're scared," James said, and there was no judgment in it, just observation. "I'm practical," Clara corrected. "There's a difference." He moved closer, not touching her but near enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Because from where I'm standing it looks like fear dressed up as common sense. You felt it too, during the dance. That connection, that ease. Don't tell me you didn't." "Feeling something doesn't make it right," Clara said, but her voice wavered slightly. "Doesn't make it possible. What if we just started with coffee?" James said. "Not a date, not a declaration of anything. Just 2 people who work on the same ranch, discussing business over coffee. We were going to talk about the expansion plans anyway. That's perfectly professional." Clara wanted to say no. Every practical bone in her body screamed that this was a mistake, that crossing even this small line would lead to complications she didn't need. But another part of her, the part that had felt alive during their dance, that had enjoyed the honest conversation and the way he looked at her like she mattered, wanted to say yes. "Just coffee," she said finally. "About ranch business." "Just coffee," James agreed, but his smile suggested he understood the victory for what it was. A small opening, a possibility where before there had been none. The party wound down around 1 in the morning. Guests departed in carriages and automobiles, their laughter fading into the night. Clara helped Mrs. Dorothy oversee the initial cleanup, refusing to stand idle while others worked. It earned her approving nods from the kitchen staff and another disapproving glance from Victoria, who was among the last to leave. "Such a quaint evening," Victoria said to James as she pulled on her gloves. Her eyes flicked to Clara, who was stacking champagne glasses on a tray. "Though I do hope you'll return to 2 traditional guest lists next year. One wouldn't want to give people the wrong impression about the ranch's standards." "The only impression I want to give," James said evenly, "is that the Whitmore Ranch values the people who actually make it run, not just those who show up once a year to be seen at the right parties." Victoria's smile tightened. "How progressive of you, Do send my regards to your aunt in Denver. She swept out, leaving a wake of cold disapproval. James walked Clara home through the darkness, insisting, despite her protests, that she didn't need an escort. The silk shawl was still draped over her shoulders, and she'd forgotten she was wearing it until James mentioned she should keep it. "I can't keep your mother's shawl," Clara said, as they walked the familiar path toward the workers' compound. "Consider it a loan, then, until we have that coffee meeting." James's tone was light, but Clara heard the subtext. The shawl was an excuse for another encounter, a thread connecting this evening to whatever came next. They reached her small house, and Clara paused at the bottom of the porch steps. The distance between them felt charged with unspoken things, possibilities that frightened and tempted her in equal measure. "Thank you for coming tonight," James said. "You made an evening I was dreading into something I'll actually remember fondly." "Thank you for asking," Clara replied. She wanted to say more to acknowledge the shift between them, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she touched the shawl briefly. "I'll take good care of this." "I know you will." James hesitated, as though considering whether to say something more, then simply nodded. "Good night, Clara." "Good night, James." She watched him walk back toward the main house, his figure disappearing into the darkness. Only then did she climb the steps and enter her home, closing the door softly behind her. The dress suddenly felt heavy, the shoes unbearably tight. She changed back into her nightgown and hung the dress carefully on the back of her closet door. The shawl she draped over her reading chair, where the lamplight caught the gold threads and made them shimmer. Clara lay in bed, exhausted but unable to sleep, her mind turning over the evening's events. She'd crossed a line tonight, stepped out of the safe boundaries she'd maintained for 20 years. The question was whether she could step back, return to the comfortable distance of employer and employee, or whether that distance was already gone, destroyed by honest conversation and one surprisingly perfect dance. Her father's work glove sat on the dresser, a reminder of who she was and where she came from. But beside them now, in her mind at least, was the image of a gold pocket watch, 3 generations of initials engraved on the back, and a man who carried the weight of legacy but wanted to build something new. She fell asleep still wearing her questions like armor, still unsure whether what she felt was hope or simply the dangerous beginning of a mistake she'd spent years regretting. The coffee meeting happened 3 days later in James's office, a room Clara had only entered twice in 20 years, both times to discuss emergency repairs that couldn't wait. The space surprised her with its understated comfort. Books lined 2 walls, titles ranging from modern ranching techniques to classic literature. A large oak desk dominated the center, its surface covered with maps, ledgers, and what looked like architectural drawings. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, warming the Persian rug and making the leather chairs glow amber. James cleared a space at the desk and spread out a hand-drawn map of the ranch, weighted at the corners with smooth river stones. "This is what I've been thinking about," he said, all business now, though his eyes held warmth when he looked at her. "The north pastures haven't been rotated properly in years. My father believed in keeping cattle in one place, letting them graze it down completely before moving them. But I've been reading about rotational grazing, about giving the land time to recover." Clara leaned over the map, recognizing every landmark, every fence line. She'd walked most of this land on foot at one time or another. "Your father's method worked for a while," she said carefully, "but the soil's tired now. You can see it in the grass quality, in how long it takes to come back after winter. Rotating would help, but you'd need more fence sections, more water sources in each grazing area." "That's what I thought." James pulled out another sheet, this one covered in calculations and sketches. "I had the surveyor out last month. We could divide the north section into 6 rotational paddocks, install solar-powered water pumps at 3 locations, and move the herd every 2 weeks during the growing season." They spent the next hour bent over the maps and drawings, Clara pointing out potential problems James hadn't considered. a seasonal creek that flooded in spring, making one proposed fence line impractical, a rocky section where post-driving would be near impossible, but also opportunities he'd missed, natural shelter belts that could serve as boundaries, existing water sources that just needed cleaning out. "You see things I don't," James said, making notes on his drawings. "I can read all the books in the world about ranching, but you've got 20 years of actual experience. That's worth more than any degree." "Different kinds of knowledge," Clara said, uncomfortable with the praise. "You've got the vision, the ability to see the whole picture. I just know the details." "The details are what make or break a plan," James countered. He set down his pencil and looked at her directly. "I want to do this right, Clara. Not just the grazing rotation, but all of it. Running this ranch in a way that respects the land and the people who work it. I can't do that without input from people like you." "People like me," Clara repeated. "You mean the workers?" "I mean the people who actually know what they're doing instead of just inheriting the right last name." There was frustration in his voice now, something that had been building beneath the surface. "My father ran this place like a kingdom. His word was law, his decisions were final, and anyone who questioned him was shown the door. I watched him make mistakes that cost people their livelihoods, because he was too proud to admit he might be wrong about something." Clara heard something in his tone, an old pain not quite healed. "You disagreed with him about something specific." James was quiet for a moment, staring at the map without really seeing it. "About safety protocols, about worker compensation, about a dozen things that mattered to the people who actually did the dangerous work while he sat in this office and collected the profits." He looked up at her. "We had a falling out over it right before he died. Never got a chance to make it right." "That's a hard burden to carry," Clara said softly. "It's part of why I want to do things differently. To prove to myself, maybe to his memory, that there's a better way." James rolled up the drawings carefully. "These meetings, getting your input, it's not just about the ranch. It's about building something that honors the work people do, that acknowledges their value beyond just labor." They began meeting twice a week after that, always in his office, always ostensibly about ranch business. But the conversations expanded beyond fence lines and grazing rotation. They talked about everything from water conservation to the changing cattle markets, to the way the light hit the mountains in late afternoon. James shared his frustrations with board members who cared only about profit margins, and Clara found herself revealing her own dreams of how the ranch could be run if practical experience mattered as much as inherited wealth. The other ranch hands noticed, of course. Started making jokes about Clara being promoted to management, asked if she was going to start wearing fancy dresses to work. She handled it with good humor, deflecting the teasing without denying the friendship that was clearly developing. Most of them were happy for her, grateful that someone from their world had James's ear. A few were resentful, thought she was getting above herself, but Clara had weathered worse in years on the ranch. Miss Dorothy watched it all with knowing eyes and said nothing, though she made sure to keep fresh coffee in James's office, and sometimes left fresh baked goods on the side table during their meetings. Small acts of approval that Clara appreciated more than she could say. Victoria Ashford, however, was less subtle in her disapproval. She began appearing at the ranch more frequently, always with some excuse: papers for James to sign, questions about upcoming social events, concerns about ranch investments she'd heard about from mutual friends. She was always impeccably dressed, always perfectly composed, and she always managed to arrive during Clara's scheduled meetings with James. "I'm so sorry to interrupt," Victoria would say, though her tone suggested no such thing. "But this really can't wait, James. You understand." And James, raised to be polite even to people he didn't particularly like, would excuse himself to deal with whatever urgent matter Victoria had manufactured. One afternoon in early autumn, after Victoria had interrupted for the third time that week, Clara gathered her notes and stood to leave. I should get back to work anyway. We can finish discussing the water system another time. Clara, wait. James looked frustrated, torn between courtesy and genuine desire for her to stay. This won't take long. It's fine, Clara said, meaning it. She has a claim on your time that I don't. That's just the way things are. But as she left the office, she heard Victoria's voice, pitched just loud enough to carry. Honestly, James, people are starting to talk. That woman in your office twice a week, those long meetings, you must know how it looked. Clara didn't stay to hear James's response. She'd known this was coming, had felt the weight of judgment building like a summer storm. She went back to work, checking fence lines with perhaps more vigor than necessary, driving posts with unnecessary force. By the time the sun started to set, her shoulders ached, and her hands were sore even through the worn leather of her father's gloves. She was loading tools into the truck when James found her. His jaw set in a way she'd learned meant he was angry about something. Victoria had no right to say what she said. She had every right, Clara said, not looking at him. She's worried about your reputation, about what people think. That's what people in her world do. I don't give a damn what people think. Yes, you do. Clara finally turned to face him. You care because you have to. Because reputation affects business, affects the ranch, affects all the people who depend on this place for their living. Victoria understands that, even if her motives aren't pure. So what are you saying? That we should stop meeting? That we should pretend there's not a genuine friendship developing here? I'm saying we need to be realistic about what this is and what it can be. Clara chose her words carefully, aware that they were standing at a crossroads. You're lonely, James. I understand that, and I enjoy our conversations more than I probably should. But that doesn't change the facts. You're the owner. I'm the employee. You move in circles where people wear diamonds and discuss investments. I fix fences and smell like horse most days. Those worlds don't mix, not permanently. They could if we wanted them to, James said stubbornly. Want isn't always enough. Clara softened her tone. I lost my husband 8 years ago. Spent a long time putting myself back together after that. I'm not willing to risk that stability for something that has no real future. And neither should you be. Not when you've got a ranch to run, and responsibilities that go beyond just what you want. James looked at her for a long moment, and Clara saw the struggle in his eyes, the war between what he wanted and what he knew was practical. Finally he nodded. You're right. Of course you're right. I just wish you weren't. So do I, Clara admitted quietly. But wishing doesn't change reality. They stood in awkward silence, the evening air cooling around them. Everything that had been building between them, the friendship and whatever else it might have become, suddenly felt fragile and uncertain. Clara wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap that had opened, but she didn't know how without making things worse. The expansion plans are good, she said finally, retreating to safer ground. If you move forward with them, you'll see improvement in the grazing within 2 seasons. I'll move forward, James said. And I'd still like your input, if you're willing to give it. Strictly professional, Clara echoed, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. She drove home as darkness fell, her father's work gloves on the seat beside her, like a reminder of who she was and where she belonged. The silk shawl still hung over her reading chair, and she looked at it for a long time that night, wondering if she should return it, cut the thread that still connected them. But she couldn't quite bring herself to do it. Not yet. The next few weeks passed in a strange limbo. Clara and James maintained their meetings, but the ease had gone out of them. They discussed ranch business with careful professionalism, never veering into personal territory, never letting the conversation linger after the work was done. It was exactly what Clara had said they needed, but it felt wrong in ways she couldn't articulate. The other ranch hands noticed the change and stopped their teasing. Mrs. Dorothy's knowing looks turned sympathetic. Even the cattle seemed to sense Clara's restlessness, shying away from her when normally they'd approach with calm trust. Victoria increased her presence, sensing victory. She was at the ranch almost daily now, always with legitimate business but clearly staking her claim. James was polite but distant with her, and Clara took some small petty satisfaction in seeing Victoria's frustration at not getting the response she wanted. One cold October morning, Clara was in the barn checking on a pregnant mare when she overheard two of the younger hands talking in the tack room. They didn't know she was there, and their voices carried clearly through the wooden walls. Heard Mr. Whitmore's thinking about selling off the north section. One said, make it easier to manage the rest, plus he could use the money for that fancy development project. Victoria's been pushing. That'd mean layoffs, the other responded. North section's got 3 families working at full time. Where they gonna go? Clara felt her stomach drop. The north section, the very land they'd spent weeks planning to improve, was being considered for sale. James hadn't mentioned it, hadn't even hinted at it during their meetings. She thought about the hand-drawn map in his office, all their careful planning, the hope she'd allowed herself to about making real improvements to the ranch. She finished with the mare and walked directly to the main house, not bothering to clean up first, not caring that she was tracking mud and bringing the smell of the barn with her. Mrs. Dorothy tried to intercept her in the hallway. Clara, honey, he's got guests. Maybe you should come back later. This can't wait, Clara said, her voice tight with controlled anger. She knocked once on the office door and pushed it open without waiting for a response. James looked up from his desk, surprise crossing his face. Victoria sat in one of the leather chairs, papers spread across her lap, her expression shifting from shock to disdain as she took in Clara's work-stained clothes and muddy boots. Clara, James said, rising, is something wrong? Is there an emergency with the livestock? Is it true? Clara asked bluntly. Are you selling the north section? James's expression went carefully neutral, which was answer enough. Victoria, however, looked pleased. Ranch business is hardly appropriate discussion with the hired help, Miss Bennet. Perhaps you should wait to be summoned for your next scheduled meeting. Clara ignored her completely, keeping her eyes on James. We spent weeks planning improvements for that land. You asked for my expertise, my experience. I gave you honest advice, helped you design a system that would benefit the ranch and the workers, and all that time you were considering selling it. It's complicated, James began. It's simple. Clara cut him off. Either you valued what I had to say, or you were just humoring me. Which is it? The board is putting pressure on me, James said, and Clara heard frustration in his voice. Expenses are up, profits are down. Victoria's development company has made a generous offer for the north section. The money would allow us to modernize the rest of the ranch, update equipment, improve conditions for everyone, and put 3 families out of work, Clara said, families who've been on this ranch for generations. But I suppose that's just the cost of progress. Victoria stood, smoothing her skirt with deliberate calm. Miss Bennet, I understand you're upset, but you're speaking about matters you don't fully comprehend. Business decisions require considering multiple factors, not just sentimental attachment to tradition. Sentimental attachment. Clara turned to her now, years of restrained irritation finally finding voice. Those 3 families aren't tradition, they're people. Real people, with children and mortgages, and lives that depend on this ranch. But I suppose they're just numbers on a balance sheet to you. Clara, that's enough, James said, his voice carrying authority. She rarely heard from him. You're right, Clara said, suddenly exhausted. It is enough. More than enough. She looked at James, and something in her chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with anger. I thought you were different from your father. I thought you actually cared about doing things the right way, about honoring the work and the workers. I was wrong. You don't understand the position I'm in, James said, and there was pleading in his voice now. I understand perfectly, Clara said quietly. You talked a good game about changing things, about building something better, but when it comes down to it, you're going to do exactly what your father would have done. Choose profit over people. Convenience over conscience. She turned toward the door, then stopped. I'll have my resignation on your desk by tomorrow morning. I'm sure Victoria can help you find someone more appropriate to replace me. Clara, don't. James moved around the desk, reaching for her, but she stepped back. It's Miss Bennet, she said, putting formality between them like armor. And I'm done. With the meetings, with the plans, with all of it. You want to sell the north section. That's your right as owner. But I don't have to watch you do it. She left before he could respond, walking out of the main house with her head high and her heart breaking in ways she'd promised herself she'd never allow again. The afternoon sun was bright and cold, turning the mountains harsh and beautiful against the endless sky. Clara stood on the wide porch, breathing hard, trying to process what had just happened. She'd let herself hope. That was the mistake. She'd let herself believe that things could be different, that James meant what he said about changing how the ranch operates. She'd let down her guard, and now she was paying the price for that foolishness. Behind her she heard raised voices from the office. James and Victoria arguing about something, but she didn't stay to listen. She had work to finish before she left this place for good. Clara spent the rest of the afternoon in mechanical routine, checking fence lines she'd checked 100 times before, her mind churning through anger and hurt in equal measure. She was finishing up near the old equipment shed when she noticed the door ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. The shed wasn't used much anymore, mostly stored outdated tools and records that weren't worth keeping in the main office, but weren't quite ready to be thrown away. She should have left it alone, should have just closed the door and moved on. But something about the dim interior caught her eye, and she found herself stepping inside, pulling the chain on the single bulb that hung from the rafters. Weak light spilled across boxes of old paperwork, rusted equipment, and shelves thick with dust. In the back corner, she spotted a filing cabinet she'd never noticed before, its drawers slightly open as though someone had been through it recently and hadn't closed it properly. Curious despite herself, Clara pulled open the top drawer. Personnel files, decades old, names she recognized from her early years on the ranch. Some had moved on, others had retired, a few had died. She was about to close it when she saw a familiar name on one of the folders. Thomas Bennet. Her husband's fired. Clara pulled it out with hands that had started to tremble. She'd never seen Tom's official employment records, had never thought to ask for them. The file was thin, containing hire date, pay records, and a few performance notes from supervisors. Standard documentation, but at the back, clipped together with a rusty paperclip, were several pages that made her breath catch. Incident report, dated May 15th, 25 years ago, 2 years before Tom died. Clara read with growing horror as the dry bureaucratic language described an equipment failure in the north pasture. A fence post driver, with faulty hydraulics, had malfunctioned, catching Tom's left hand and crushing 2 fingers. The report noted he'd been taken to the county hospital, treated, and returned to work 3 days later, with modified duties. But it was the next document that made Clara's vision blur with fury. A settlement agreement, signed by James Whitmore II, offering Tom $500 in exchange for not pursuing any legal action or workers' compensation claim for injuries sustained due to equipment failure. The agreement specifically noted that the ranch acknowledged no wrongdoing or negligence in the maintenance of equipment. Clara remembered that injury. Tom had come home with his hand bandaged, said he'd been careless, caught it in a gate. He'd been in pain for weeks, could never fully use those fingers again. She'd believed his story about the gate because Tom had never been one to complain, never wanted to make trouble. Now she understood. He'd taken the settlement, probably felt he had no choice with a wife and 2 children to feed, and he'd lied to protect her from worry. She kept reading, her hands shaking. There were 2 more incident reports over the next year. Back strain from lifting equipment that should have been handled by 2 men, but Tom was working alone. A mild concussion from being kicked by a startled horse in a pen that was noted as being too small for safe handling. Each time, Small settlement. Each time, documentation that absolved the ranch of responsibility. The final document was a medical examiner's report, attached with a note in handwriting she didn't recognize. Tom's death certificate listed cause of death as myocardial infarction, heart attack, but the medical examiner's note, written as an addendum, suggested that chronic pain and untreated injuries may have contributed to stress-related cardiac events. It recommended follow-up investigation into workplace conditions. There was no evidence any such investigation had occurred. Instead, someone had stamped the file "closed, resolved" and buried it in this forgotten cabinet. Clara stood in the dusty shed, her husband's file clutched in her hands, and felt the world tilt on its axis. Tom hadn't died because his heart simply gave out. He died because he'd been worked too hard, injured too often, and the ranch, James's father, had covered it up with paperwork and small payments that were insultingly inadequate. And James had known, or if he hadn't known specifically about Tom, he'd known about his father's practices, the corner cutting and the cover-ups. That's what their argument had been about, the falling out he'd mentioned. He'd known, and he'd never said a word to her, never thought to mention during their weeks of meetings and honest conversations that his father had essentially worked her husband to death and paid him off to keep quiet about it. Clara felt betrayed in a way that went deeper than the land sale, deeper than any romantic disappointment. This was about her husband's life, about justice denied, about 20 years she'd spent working for the family that had killed the man she loved and never acknowledged it. She tucked the file under her arm and walked directly back to the main house. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed mockingly beautiful. Victoria's car was gone from the drive, and Clara was grimly grateful for small mercies. This conversation needed to happen without an audience. Miss Dorothy saw her coming, and must have read something in her face because she simply pointed toward the office and said nothing. Clara knocked once, then entered without waiting for permission. James was at his desk, head in his hands, looking thoroughly miserable. He looked up when she entered, and whatever he saw in her expression made him go very still. "I found something," Clara said, her voice eerily calm. She dropped the file on his desk. "In the old equipment shed. My husband's personnel file." James looked at the file, then at her, and she saw understanding dawn in his eyes. "Clara, I can explain." "Can you?" She opened the file, spread the documents across his desk with deliberate care. "Can you explain why your father paid my husband $500 to keep quiet about equipment that crushed his hand? Can you explain why there are 3 documented injuries in 1 year, all from preventable causes, all settled with paperwork designed to protect the ranch instead of the worker?" "I didn't know," James said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You knew your father cut corners on safety. You told me yourself you argued about it. You knew he put profits over people." Clara's voice shook now, the calm cracking. "Did you know about Tom specifically? Did you know my husband died because of negligence your father covered up?" James stood, reaching for her, but she backed away. "I swear to you, I didn't know about Tom. I was in Denver when he died, didn't come back until after the funeral. My father never mentioned it, never showed me these files. But you're right that I knew about his practices in general. I knew, and I couldn't stop him. You were his son, his heir. You had more power than any worker ever would." "I was 28 years old," James said, and there was anguish in his voice now, fresh out of business school, full of ideas about how things should be done. "My father laughed at me, told me I didn't understand the real world, didn't understand that ranching was a business, not a charity. We fought about it constantly. He threatened to write me out of the will if I didn't fall in line." "So you fell in line," Clara said flatly. "No, I left. Spent 4 years in Denver working for other ranchers, learning the business from the ground up, waiting for him to change or die or something." James's voice cracked. "He had a stroke before we could reconcile. Left me this place and all his mistakes, and I've spent 12 years trying to undo the damage while keeping the ranch solvent." Clara wanted to feel sympathy, but the papers on the desk burned in her vision. "You've had 12 years. 12 years you could have gone through these records, found the people your father hurt, and made it right. Instead, you let them sit in a shed, gathering dust, forgotten." "You're right," James said simply. "I was a coward. I knew there were things in the past I didn't want to look at too closely, problems that would be expensive and complicated to fix. So I focused on moving forward, on doing better going forward, and I told myself that was enough." He met her eyes. "It wasn't enough. You deserved to know. Tom deserved justice." "I'm sorry." The apology hung in the air between them, inadequate but genuine. Clara felt her anger warring with something more complicated, a recognition that James was carrying his own burden of guilt and legacy. "Sorry doesn't bring him back," Clara said, but the heat had gone out of her voice. She sank into one of the leather chairs, suddenly exhausted. "Sorry doesn't give me back the years I spent thinking he died because his heart was weak, blaming myself for not noticing how much pain he was in, wondering if I could have done something different." James sat heavily in the chair beside her, not behind his aunts but next to her, equal ground. "What can I do? Tell me what would make this right, and I'll do it." "There's no making it right," Clara said, "but you can start by finding out if Tom was the only one, or if there are other families your father hurt." She gestured to the file. "If these records exist for my husband, they probably exist for others." "I'll look," James promised. "First thing tomorrow, I'll go through every file in that shed, every record we have. Anyone who was hurt, anyone who was paid off to stay quiet, I'll find them, and I'll make proper compensation." "It'll cost you," Clara warned. "Could cost you the ranch if there are enough of them. Then it costs me the ranch." James's voice was firm now, resolved. "I meant what I said about doing things differently, about honoring the people who actually make this place work. I can't do that while standing on a foundation built from my father's mistakes and other people's suffering." Clara studied his face, looking for deception or self-interest, but found only weary determination. "Victoria won't like it. Your board won't like it. You'll lose support from the people who keep this operation running. Then I'll find new support, or I'll run it alone until I can't anymore." James leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I'm tired of doing what's expected, what's profitable, what keeps everyone comfortable. My father's way nearly destroyed this ranch's soul, even if the bank account stayed healthy. I won't continue that legacy." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling around them. Clara thought about Tom, about the life they'd built, and the way it had ended. She thought about the 20 years she'd spent on this ranch, the pride she'd taken in her work, and how all of it now felt tainted by knowledge she wished she didn't have. "I can't work here anymore," she said finally. "Not after knowing. Every time I look at this place, I'll think about what it cost Tom, what it cost me." "I understand," James said quietly. "But before you go, will you help me make this right? You know the workers, know which families have been here long enough to have been affected. You know how to talk to them in a way they'll trust. I need your help, Clara, not as an employee but as someone who understands what's at stake." Clara wanted to refuse, wanted to walk away from the ranch and never look back, let James deal with the consequences of his father's actions alone. But she thought about the other families, about workers who might not even know they deserved compensation, who might be carrying their own buried resentments and unanswered questions. "1 month," she said. "I'll give you 1 month to sort through the records and make contact with anyone who needs to be contacted. After that, I'm done." 1 month, James agreed. He stood and offered his hand, formal and businesslike. "Thank you." Clara shook his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm that matched her own. Whatever else he was, whatever mistakes he carried, James worked the ranch himself, got his hands dirty alongside his employees. That counted for something, even now. The next morning they began the grim work of excavating the past. The equipment shed yielded boxes of old personnel files, incident reports, settlement agreements spanning 30 years of ranch operation. James hired a lawyer from Cheyenne to review the documents, and Clara helped identify workers and their families, some still in the area, others scattered across Wyoming and beyond. The patterns that emerged were damning: faulty equipment, inadequate training, unreasonable demands for productivity that led to shortcuts and accidents. James Whitmore II had run the ranch like a machine, and when parts of that machine broke, he'd simply replaced them and paid just enough to avoid legal trouble. They found 14 cases over 3 decades where workers had been injured and paid settlements far below what their injuries warranted. 2 had died. Like Tom, their deaths attributed to natural causes, but with underlying notes suggesting workplace stress and untreated injuries. Another 5 had been forced into early retirement due to disabilities that were never properly compensated. The rest had simply disappeared from the records, presumably leaving the ranch for other work, carrying their injuries and resentments with them. James grew quieter as the evidence mounted, the lines around his eyes deepening with each new file they uncovered. He worked late into the nights, reviewing documents with the lawyer, calculating what fair compensation would look like for injuries suffered years or decades ago. The numbers were staggering. Even with conservative estimates, making things right would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, money the ranch didn't have liquid, without selling assets or taking on significant debt. Clara watched him wrestle with the mathematics of justice, and something in her hardened heart began to soften despite herself. He could have ignored all of this, could have resealed the shed and pretended the files didn't exist. Instead, he was choosing the harder path, the one that would cost him dearly. "The board will never approve this," James said one evening, staring at the spreadsheets covering his desk. "Victoria's already been calling, heard rumors about what we're doing. She thinks I've lost my mind." "Have you?" Clara asked. James looked up at her, a tired smile crossing his face. "Maybe, but if losing your mind means finally doing the right thing, then I'll take it." He pushed the papers aside. "I've been thinking about what you said, about legacy. My grandfather built this ranch from nothing, and I always thought that meant I had to preserve it exactly as it was, maintain it as some kind of monument to his achievement. But maybe the real legacy should be making sure it becomes something worth preserving." "That's a noble thought," Clara said carefully. "But nobility doesn't pay compensation to injured workers." "No, but selling the north section would." James pulled out a different set of papers, these ones crisp and new. "Victoria's development offer is for $800,000, more than enough to compensate everyone affected, and modernize equipment on the remaining land to prevent future incidents." Clara felt something twist in her chest. The 3 families working that section would lose their jobs. "I could offer them positions on the remaining acreage. It would mean some reorganization, but it's possible." James met her eyes. "I know it's not perfect. I know I'm choosing between different groups of people who all deserve better. But if the choice is between making partial amends for the past or doing nothing at all, I have to choose action, even if it means betraying the principles you talked about keeping the ranch whole, about honoring the workers." "I'm trying to honor the workers," James said, frustration creeping into his voice. "All of them, not just the ones currently employed. The families my father hurt deserve justice too." Clara couldn't argue with that, even though it pained her to admit he was right. "When will you make the announcement?" "The board meets in 2 weeks. I'll present the proposal then." James rubbed his face, exhaustion evident in every line. "I need to talk to the 3 families first, explain the situation, offer them the option to stay on in different capacities. I'd like you there when I do it, if you're willing. They trust you more than they trust me." "I'll be there," Clara said, though she dreaded the conversation. Telling people they were losing their homes and livelihoods, even with the promise of alternative work, was never easy. The legal documents piled up on James's desk, compensation agreements drafted by his lawyer in precise language that tried to quantify suffering in dollar amounts. Clara helped contact the affected families, some of whom she'd lost touch with over the years. The conversations were difficult, dredging up old pain and resentment. Some were grateful for the acknowledgement and the money. Others were angry that it had taken so long, that justice had waited until they were too old or too broken to fully benefit from it. Through it all, Clara and James worked side by side. Their relationship transformed from whatever it had been before into something harder to define. Partners in this grim task, united by shared purpose, even as the personal distance between them remained. They were careful not to let conversations drift into personal territory, kept everything focused on the work at hand. But Clara found herself noticing small things. The way James's hands trembled slightly when signing the compensation check. The nights he stayed at the office until dawn, as though working himself to exhaustion was penance for his father's sins. The quiet determination with which he faced criticism from his social circle, people who thought he was throwing away his legacy for the sake of appeasing workers who should have been grateful just to have jobs. Miss Dorothy brought them meals they often forgot to eat, left coffee that went cold on the desk. She said little, but her presence was a steady comfort, a reminder that some people understood what they were trying to do, even if they couldn't fix everything. The meeting with the 3 families from the North section was scheduled for a Sunday afternoon in the ranch's small community hall, a building that had hosted everything from barn dances to memorial services over the decades. James insisted on hosting it there rather than in his office, wanting it to feel less like an eviction notice and more like a community discussion. Clara arrived early and helped set up chairs, her stomach tight with dread. She knew these families. The Richardsons had worked the North section for 15 years, had 3 teenage children planning to stay on the ranch after graduation. The Ortiz family had been there for 8 years, saving money to buy their own small place someday. And the Chens were the newest, only 3 years in, but they'd left good jobs in town to take the ranch positions, believing in the stability of the work. James arrived with file folders and a determined expression, though Clara could see the tension in his shoulder. They waited in uncomfortable silence as the families filed in, their faces showing confusion and worry. News had spread that something important was happening, and ranch gossip had filled in the gaps with increasingly dire speculation. When everyone was seated, James stood. He didn't use notes, didn't hide behind corporate language or excuses. He told them the truth, plain and direct, about his father's negligence, about the pattern of injuries and cover-ups, about his decision to compensate the affected family, about the cost of that compensation and the need to sell the North section to Victoria's development company to fund it. "You're losing your positions through no fault of your own," James said, his voice steady despite the difficulty of the word. "You've worked this land well, been good stewards of it, but I'm faced with a choice between different moral obligations, and I've chosen to prioritize making amends for past harm over maintaining the status quo. So we're being sacrificed for your guilty conscience?" Miguel Ortiz asked, anger clear in his voice. "No," James said. "You're being offered positions on other sections of the ranch with the same pay and benefits. Your homes will need to relocate, and I'll cover all moving expenses and help with the transition. It's not ideal, I know, but I'm trying to balance justice for people who were wronged in the past with fairness to people who work here now. What if we don't want to move?" Sarah Richardson spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "Our kids are settled in school. We've got roots here. You're asking us to uproot our whole lives." "I understand," James said. "And if you choose to leave the ranch entirely, I'll provide 6 months severance pay and strong references. I'll do everything in my power to help you land on your feet. But I won't lie to you and say this isn't a difficult situation with no perfect solutions." Clara stood then, feeling the weight of 3 families' eyes on her. "I've worked with James these past weeks, going through the records. What his father did was wrong, fundamentally wrong. People were hurt, people died, and it was covered up. James is trying to make that right, even though it costs him. Even though people like me are angry at him for things his father did. That takes courage. Easy for you to say, Miguel countered. You're not the one losing your home. You're right, Clara said, meeting his eyes. I'm not, but I lost my husband because of the way this ranch was run. And I'm choosing to believe that making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else is worth some hardship now. That's my choice. You each have to make your own. The meeting ended without resolution, the families needing time to think, to discuss among themselves. Clara and James stood in the empty hall afterward, the silence heavy with unspoken concerns. That could have gone better, James said finally. Could have gone worse, Clara replied. At least you were honest with them. That's more than your father would have done. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and as the day approached, Clara felt the tension building across the ranch. Word had spread about James's intentions, and the response was divided. Some workers saw it as long overdue justice, finally acknowledging the dangers and sacrifices of their work. Others worried it would set a precedent that would make the ranch financially unstable, threatening all their jobs. Victoria called James repeatedly, her tone shifting from concerned to angry to coldly professional, as she realized he was serious about his plans. She wanted the land sale without the messy compensation attached, wanted a clean business transaction that didn't involve dredging up the past. The morning of the board meeting, Clara woke early and dressed carefully. James had asked her to attend, to speak if necessary about her experience, and the records they'd uncovered. She wore the green dress from the ball, the one Dorothy had loaned her, because it felt like armor somehow, a reminder that she could move between worlds when she needed to. The boardroom was on the second floor of the main house, a formal space Clara had never entered in 20 years. Long table of polished mahogany, leather chairs, portraits of previous Whitmores on the walls watching with stern expressions. 8 board members were already seated when she arrived, their faces showing various degrees of surprise at her presence. Victoria sat at the far end, dressed in sharp business attire, her expression carefully neutral. She nodded to Clara with cold courtesy, acknowledging her presence without welcoming it. James entered last, carrying a leather portfolio thick with documents. He looked tired but determined, his jaw set in a way Clara had come to recognize as his preparing for battle expression. He took his seat at the head of the table and gestured for Clara to sit in the chair to his right, the position traditionally held by the ranch's operations manager. "Thank you all for coming," James began. "I know some of you have concerns about the direction I'm proposing for the ranch, and I want to address those concerns directly and honestly." He outlined his findings methodically, presenting the incident reports and settlement agreements with clinical precision. He didn't shy away from the ugly truth of his father's practices, didn't try to soften the impact with euphemisms or corporate language. The board members' expressions shifted from skepticism to discomfort to, in a few cases, genuine horror as the scope of the wrongdoing became clear. "My proposal is twofold," James continued. "First, to provide fair compensation to all workers who were injured or killed due to negligence over the past 30 years. The estimated cost is $650,000. Second, to fund this compensation and necessary equipment upgrades by accepting Victoria's development offer for the north section, valued at $800,000. That's a significant loss of productive land," one of the older board members said. Harold Brewster, who'd served with James's father and grandfather. "Your father spent years building that section up, improving the grazing, the water systems. You're proposing to throw all that away." "I'm proposing to acknowledge that some of that building came at the cost of workers' health and lives," James replied, "and that pretending otherwise makes us complicit in those wrongs." "Noble sentiment," Victoria interjected smoothly, "but sentiment doesn't run a ranch. You're talking about setting a precedent that could bankrupt us. Every worker with a grievance, real or imagined, will come looking for compensation. These aren't imagined grievances, Clara said, speaking for the first time. All eyes turned to her, and she felt the weight of their judgment, their surprise that a ranch hand would dare speak in this setting. These are documented injuries, covered up with inadequate settlements and legal threats. My husband was one of them. Tom Bennett worked this ranch for 15 years, was injured 3 times due to faulty equipment and dangerous conditions, and died at 45 with untreated injuries that contributed to his heart failure. The room went silent. Several board members had the grace to look uncomfortable. Harold Brewster's expression hardened. That's a serious accusation, Miss Bennett. Your husband signed settlement agreements. He accepted the terms. He accepted what he could get to feed his family, Clara said, her voice steady. That's not the same as justice. And if you think signing a piece of paper erases moral responsibility, then you're part of the problem. James, another board member, spoke up. Patricia Chen, one of the few women on the board. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but the financial risk is substantial. What guarantee do we have that this won't open us up to further lawsuits, further claims? James pulled another document from his portfolio. The compensation agreements include full legal releases, drafted by our attorney. Workers accept the settlement in exchange for waiving future claims. It's legally sound and morally appropriate. And the land sale, Harold pressed. You're essentially letting Victoria profit from your guilt. She's been after that section for years, and now you're handing it to her. I'm accepting a fair market offer that allows us to make necessary changes, James corrected. If anyone else wants to make a competitive bid for the north section, I'll consider it. But the compensation is happening regardless. That's not negotiable. Victoria leaned forward. James, think about this carefully. Your father built this ranch into what it is today. Yes, he made mistakes, but that was a different time, different standards. You can't judge the past by present-day ethics. I'm not judging the past, James said. I'm taking responsibility for it. There's a difference. And what about your responsibility to this board? Harold asked. To the investors who've supported this ranch for decades. To the legacy you inherited. My responsibility, James said slowly, is to build something worth inheriting, not to perpetuate a system built on exploitation and covered-up negligence. He stood, pulling out one final document. Which brings me to the second part of my proposal. He unfolded the ranch deed, the original document signed by his grandfather in 1895, establishing the Whitmore Ranch. Clara had never seen it before, the aged paper covered in elaborate script and official seals. This deed represents 3 generations of Whitmore ownership, James. It also represents 3 generations of workers who built this ranch with their labor, their expertise, and sometimes their blood. I'm proposing a restructuring of ownership to reflect that reality. The room erupted, board members talking over each other, Victoria's face going pale with shock, Harold's sputtering indignation. James waited for the noise to die down before continuing. I'm proposing to convert 30% of the ranch to a workers' cooperative structure. Current employees would have ownership stakes proportional to their tenure and role. They'd have voting rights on major decisions, profit-sharing arrangements, and real investment in the ranch's success. You're out of your mind, Harold said flatly. Your grandfather would be rolling in his grave. Maybe, James agreed, or maybe he'd recognize that the ranch can't survive without the people who actually make it work, and giving them real stakes in its success is good business as well as good ethics. He looked directly at Clara. Miss Bennett would be offered an equal partnership in operations, with decision-making authority alongside mine. Clara felt her breath catch. She hadn't known about this part, hadn't been consulted about a partnership. She saw the calculation in it, the public commitment, that would make it harder for the board to reject the entire proposal, but she also saw genuine respect in James's eyes. This is insanity, Victoria said, standing abrupt. You're throwing away everything your family built for some misguided social experiment. Workers aren't equipped to make business decisions. They don't have the education, the perspective, the financial understanding. They have the practical knowledge that actually makes this ranch function, Clara said, finding her voice despite the shock of James's announcement. They know which equipment is failing before it breaks down completely. They know which grazing patterns work and which don't. They know the daily reality of this operation better than anyone sitting in boardrooms making decisions based on quarterly reports. She's right, Patricia Chen said quietly. I've toured enough operations to know that the best-run ranches are the ones where workers feel invested in the outcome. This proposal is radical, yes, but it's not without merit. It's financial suicide, Harold insisted. James, your father made me promise to look after this ranch if anything happened to him. I can't in good conscience support a plan that will destroy everything he built. My father built something impressive, James said. He also built it on a foundation of exploitation and cover-ups. I'd rather see the ranch reduced in size, but operating with integrity, than maintain its current scope through the same practices that killed Clara's husband and injured dozens of others. The vote, when it came, was closer than Clara expected. 4 board members sided with James, drawn by Patricia's argument about worker investment and the legal necessity of addressing past wrongs. 4 voted against, including Harold and Victoria, who saw it as a betrayal of tradition and sound business practice. James held the deciding vote as majority owner. The motion carries, he said quietly. We'll proceed with the compensation fund, the land sale, and the cooperative restructuring. Those who wish to resign from the board, I'll accept your resignations with thanks for your service. Harold stood immediately, his face flushed with anger. You're making a mistake, boy. This ranch won't survive 5 years under this kind of management. When it fails, don't come looking for help from those of us who tried to save you from yourself. He stalked out, and 2 other board members followed after a moment's hesitation. Victoria remained seated, her expression unreadable. Finally she said, I'll honor the land purchase agreement, but I want it clear that I think you're destroying your legacy. Your father would be ashamed. My father, James said evenly, created the circumstances that led to this necessity. If he were alive, I'd tell him the same thing. Victoria gathered her papers with precise, angry movements and left without another word. The remaining board members looked shell-shocked, but Patricia managed a small smile. Well, she said, that was certainly dramatic. I hope you know what you're doing, James. So do I, James admitted, but I know that doing nothing was no longer an option. After the others had left, Clara and James sat alone in the boardroom. The ranch deed lay on the table between them. This document that had defined ownership and power for 3 generations now being rewritten to include people who'd never imagined having such authority. You should have told me, Clara said finally, about the partnership offer, before announcing it to the whole board. I know, James said. I'm sorry. I was worried you'd refuse, and I needed the board to see that I was serious about including workers in decision-making, that it wasn't just theory but practical reality. I should refuse, Clara said. I'm a ranch hand, not a business partner. I don't have the education, the background for this kind of responsibility. You have 20 years of experience and more practical knowledge than anyone I know, James countered. And you have integrity, which is more valuable than any business degree. Will you consider it? At least give it a trial period. Clara looked at the deed, at the elaborate script and official seals, at the history contained in that single piece of paper. She thought about Tom, about the other workers who'd been hurt, about the families currently on the ranch who deserved better than what previous generations had received. 6 months, she said. Trial partnership for 6 months. If it's not working, we reassess. James's smile was tired, but genuine. 6 months. Thank you, Clara. They shook hands across the table, and Clara felt the weight of what they'd just done settling onto her shoulders. They'd burned bridges, alienated powerful people, and fundamentally changed the structure of an institution that had operated the same way for decades. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. 6 months passed like water, finding new channels through old land. The changes came gradually, some easier than others. The compensation checks went out to 14 families, accompanied by personal letters from James acknowledging the ranch's failures. Some recipients responded with gratitude, others with silence, and a few with anger that no amount of money could fully address. Clara understood all of those responses, carried her own complicated feelings about the settlement that bore Tom's name. The north section sold to Victoria's Development Company, and the 3 families relocated to other parts of the ranch with varying degrees of grace. The Richardsons adapted well, their teenagers finding new friends and new rhythm. The Ortiz family struggled more, Miguel's resentment a constant reminder that good intentions didn't erase real costs. The Chens left entirely, taking their severance and finding work on a smaller operation near Sheridan. Clara made sure James understood that this too was a cost of their choices, that doing the right thing didn't mean everyone would be happy about it. The workers' cooperative took shape slowly, with meetings and votes, and endless discussions about how to balance individual needs with collective good. Some workers embraced the new structure immediately, energized by having real voice and decision. Others were uncomfortable with the responsibility, preferred the old clarity of being told what to do. Clara found herself mediating disputes, explaining financial reports to people who'd never had to think about profit margins, learning alongside them how to transform a hierarchical operation into something more democratic. The ranch itself seemed to breathe differently under the new structure. Equipment that had been limping along was replaced with safer, more efficient alternatives. Training programs were established for dangerous tasks. A safety committee with actual authority reviewed procedures and made changes when needed. Small things, but they added up to a workplace where people felt valued rather than expendable. Clara's partnership with James evolved into something neither of them had quite expected. They worked well together, her practical experience balancing his broader vision, his willingness to take risks, tempering her natural caution. They disagreed frequently, sometimes loudly, but always with respect for what the other brought to the conversation. The personal tension that had complicated their earlier relationship faded into something steadier, a friendship built on shared purpose and mutual regard. On a crisp morning in early spring, Clara found herself back at the north pasture fence line, the section that had started everything. A new cedar post stood where she'd been working that night of the ball, the wood still fresh and pale compared to the weathered posts around it. She ran her hand over the smooth surface, thinking about all that had changed since that evening when James had walked out of his own party to find her. She heard footsteps and turned to find James approaching, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He passed her one without comment, and they stood together looking out over land that was still theirs, though shared now in ways his grandfather never could have imagined. The quarterly reports came in, James said. We're profitable barely, but trending upward. Patricia says if we maintain current trajectory, we'll be solidly in the black within a year. And if we don't, Clara asked, then we adjust, adapt, figure out what's not working and fix it. James smiled, kind of like mending a fence. You check the line, find the weak spots, shore them up before they fail completely. Clara thought about her father's work gloves, hanging now in her office rather than her small house. Thought about Tom's silver hammer, still in her truck's toolbox after all these years. Thought about the silk shawl she'd eventually returned to James, and the ranch deed that now included her name alongside his and 24 others. Your grandfather would probably hate what we've done here, she said. Probably, James agreed, but I think my mother would have loved it. Building something new while honoring what came before, finding a way forward that acknowledges the cost of getting here. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher, warming the land they both loved and had fought to transform. It wasn't perfect, would never be perfect, but it was honest. And in Clara's experience, honesty was the strongest foundation you could build on, even stronger than fence posts and wire. Even stronger than tradition and legacy. She finished her coffee, set the cup aside, and picked up her tools. There was work to do, as there always would be. But now it was work that mattered in ways that went beyond just earning a living. It was work that built something worth keeping, something worth passing on. James worked alongside her, their hands moving in practiced rhythm, fixing what needed fixing and building what needed building. Together,